下一站新加坡。
Calling all passengers, the Singapore-Hong Kong air travel bubble starts on November 22nd. No plastic bag, no problem. FairPrice is extending its no plastic bag scheme for another year. And Alibaba's 11/11 mega shopping day is underway, with consumers opening up their wallets, spending billions. Welcome to The Big Story, coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. I'm Olivia Quay. Subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss a single episode. Now, 18 new COVID-19 cases were reported today, all imported, and had already been placed on stay-home notice upon arriving in Singapore. Among the cases are 2 Singapore permanent residents as well as 14 work pass holders, including 10 foreign domestic workers. The Health Ministry will share more details tonight. Would you pay $700 for a return flight to Hong Kong, which doesn't even include the cost of a COVID-19 test? Well, that's how much flight tickets are going for now on Singapore Airlines, because from November 22nd, we in Singapore can travel to Hong Kong. Multimedia journalist Renee Poh has more.
After weeks of negotiations, there is a start date for Singapore's air travel bubble, or ATB, arrangement with Hong Kong, November 22nd. Transport Minister Ong Ye Kung announced the official milestone at a press conference this morning.
This is the first of its kind air travel bubble in the region and if not the world. It is different in 3 ways. Number 1, it is an air travel bubble between 2 regional aviation hubs. Number 2 is that there is no restriction on what kind of travelers. Thirdly, it completely replaces quarantine, stay-home notices with COVID-19 tests.
Travellers must fly on designated ATB flights operated by Singapore Airlines and Cathay Pacific. It will start with 1 flight a day into each city, with a quota of 200 passengers. But from December 7th, this will be increased to 2 flights a day in each direction. All travellers from both Singapore and Hong Kong must test negative for COVID-19 on a PCR test 72 hours before their scheduled departure. If you are flying to Hong Kong before December 1st, you will need to apply for approval to take the test at least 7 days before departure. And when you arrive in Hong Kong, you need to take another PCR test and remain at the airport until the results are confirmed. This could take about 4 hours. Visitors coming to Singapore from Hong Kong will need to apply for an air travel pass and download the Trace Together contact tracing app in lieu of taking a PCR test when they arrive here.
It's not meant to be totally symmetrical. We like the air travel pass, because should there, touch wood, be anything wrong and you have a cluster, using the pass, it allows us to control the numbers and we can throttle it down very quickly.
The ATB will be suspended for 2 weeks if the 7-day moving average of the daily number of unlinked COVID-19 cases is more than 5 in either Singapore or Hong Kong. But if the scheme is successful, Mr. Ong said it may be expanded further, with the possibility of more countries being added to the travel bubble.
This is as close as it gets to pre-COVID travel, in the sense that whoever you are now, on the Hong Kong side or Singapore side, you don't need anyone to sponsor or to tell you you can travel, or you need a special reason, then you can travel. Now the empowerment is turned around again, that as a person living in Hong Kong or Singapore for the past 14 days or more, you can travel if you want to.
Mr. Ong also said that this ATB will be a useful reference for other countries and regions that have controlled the epidemic and are contemplating opening their borders. Renee Poh for the Straits Times.
Weighing in on this development is Professor Teo Yik Ying, Dean of the Saw Swee Hock School of Public Health at the National University of Singapore. Welcome back, Professor. So, taking a PCR test upon arrival, that's a requirement for visitors to Hong Kong, but not from Hong Kong to Singapore. Instead, under this bubble, visitors to Singapore have to download the Trace Together app. Is that a cause for concern that these visitors aren't tested when they arrived?
Well, thanks for having me again. Not really, because there are actually multiple layers of safeguard that have been built in. For example, Singapore continues to perform very careful risk assessment of individual countries and cities to determine which are the ones that Singapore can relax our border control measures for mass market tourism. Hong Kong's Department of Health maintains a very close surveillance of the situation locally, and they constantly adjust their measures on the ground to minimize community transmission. So presently, the situation in Hong Kong is actually very similar to Singapore's, with very few community transmissions. The vast majority of their cases for the past few days have been linked to importations or from imported cases themselves, similar to Singapore's. So the first safeguard really is the risk assessment that Singapore performs to determine that Hong Kong is a city that is safe to open to. The second safeguard is really the pre-departure testing that travelers need to undertake 72 hours before travel. So with these two safeguards in place, the likelihood of someone entering Singapore from Hong Kong with COVID-19 is actually much lower. Now, then let's look at the unlikely scenario that someone actually comes into Singapore from Hong Kong with COVID-19. And the requirement for trace together for both locals and travelers from Hong Kong allows us to identify any exposed contacts and isolate and quarantine them quickly. So the speed that we can break any chains of transmission locally is just as important as our border control measures. And I think with these three safeguards in place, the overall risk is capped to a very low level. It's not zero, but it's extremely low.
Right. Well, comparing the measures both Singapore and Hong Kong are implementing under this bubble, would you say one side is more stringent than the other? I know you already mentioned that, the COVID-19 situation in both countries is very similar. So how come one side, it seems like Hong Kong has the more stringent measure?
Well, any country can certainly choose to be extremely strict. And of course, the strictest is actually you just close the borders to all travelers. But bear in mind that we are going to be living with COVID-19 for quite a while. And the question really is whether countries can continue to keep its borders shut indefinitely. And I'm pretty sure I've had this opinion, I mentioned this before on TBS, that having zero or low case numbers in the community when the country is under lockdown or when the borders are completely shut is not any indication that the country is able to deal with COVID-19. The real test of public health measures is always the ability to control the situation while allowing lives, businesses to return to normal levels as much as possible. Now, every additional requirement or rule that we put in place may have an impact to reduce leakages into the community, but equally, it will have an effect to deter travelers from coming in. So what Singapore has actually done is to perform the risk assessment to determine what is the level of border control measures that we need to put in place for travelers coming in from different countries. For higher risk countries, we see there are much more stringent requirements. For low risk countries and cities, including Hong Kong, we can afford to be much less strict. And importantly, these measures are not static. We constantly adjust, we review them to determine whether they should be tightened or to be relaxed further. So for Hong Kong, the risk of importation, I mentioned, is likely to be very low, especially with the safeguards that we talk about. So it's about minimizing any unnecessary friction for incoming travelers. Remember, both Singapore and Hong Kong intend to use this travel bubble to signal to the rest of the world that borders can be opened with minimum restrictions in a safe and prudent manner. The keywords here remains to be safety and prudence.
Right. Well, thanks for weighing in on that story. So let's move on to something the COVID-19 Multi-Ministry Task Force announced yesterday, making COVID-19 testing more accessible. So we learned yesterday that from December, any company or person who needs a PCR test can procure the service from approved providers. So Professor, what does this mean for public health? Are we now more responsible for getting tested on our own accord?
Well, I think this is very consistent with what has been shared around the use of more testing as part of easing into phase 3. It is certainly useful for the public to now know where they can go to have a chance to get themselves tested and to reassure themselves that they are not infected. But I see more importantly that this is going to be an important part of workplace protocols in certain sectors, including in sports, in nightlife. So even some of the higher risk sectors can resume operations. So I don't actually see it as an indication of people being more responsible when they go for testing or vice versa, that they are less responsible if they don't go for testing, but rather this is an indication of how our society in Singapore intends to keep the risk low as we allow more sectors to resume operations.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Professor. That was Professor Teo Yik Ying, Dean of the Saw Swee Hock School of Public Health at NUS. In other local news, a significant redesign of Singapore's public sector systems will take place next year. This as part of new measures to safeguard citizens' personal data. For example, a new data loss prevention program will be rolled out across the public sector to prevent unintended loss of sensitive data from laptops, networks and computer information systems. From tomorrow, NTUC FairPrice will extend its No Plastic Bag initiative for another year following positive feedback from customers. 24 outlets will take part, including FairPrice Finest and FairPrice Extra supermarkets, as well as Cheers stores. FairPrice said 15.6 million plastic bags were saved since the initiative began last November. $600,000 in plastic bag charges were collected as well, which will be donated to environmental and community causes. And Jurong East bus interchange will be relocated from December 6 to facilitate the construction of the Jurong Region Line and the Jurong East Integrated Transport Hub. To be located just opposite the current interchange, it will be in operation until the completion of the transport hub around 2027. The relocated interchange includes barrier-free alighting areas, priority queue zones with seats, as well as upgraded facilities for public transport workers. And looking beyond Singapore, if you're like me, are getting constant reminders that it's 11/11 today, the Singles' Day shopping extravaganza. Well, Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba, which started the 11/11 blitz, said orders had exceeded $56 billion by this morning. Now, Alibaba launched two primary discount periods from November 1st to the 3rd, and again today, and Alibaba will calculate gross merchandise volume over the full 11-day period as opposed to the usual 24 hours. As of 12:30 a.m. local time today, the order rate hit a record peak of 583,000 per second. Elsewhere, Hong Kong disqualified 4 opposition members of its legislature today, shortly after China's parliament adopted a resolution allowing the city's executive to expel lawmakers without having to go through the courts. On Monday, the 19 Democratic members of the 70-seat city legislature threatened to resign en masse if any of them were disqualified, saying that would reflect their unity and show how far Beijing was willing to go to crush the opposition. While the assembly is controlled by the pro-Beijing camp, the opposition's resignation would turn it into a rubber stamp. Meanwhile, the Hong Kong government has also moved to tighten restrictions for entry into the territory. From this Friday, all arrivals other than those from mainland China will have to undergo 14 days of quarantine in a hotel instead of a residential property. Currently, the rule only applies to people arriving from 15 countries deemed to be high risk. Mongolia recorded its first domestic coronavirus transmission today following hundreds of imported cases. A woman in Ulaanbaatar had been infected by her husband, a truck driver delivering goods from Russia, who tested positive after 21 days in quarantine. Another 24 people in close contact with the couple had been put in isolation. And former Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad said he's willing to take a 10% cut to his pension as long as it's used to help those who have lost their source of income. He said salaries have risen several times compared to before, and while many had lost their source of income, those in the government didn't have to endure pay cuts. He also claimed that there were no pay cuts in the private sector. Well, for more news and videos, visit straitstimes.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the red button below. I'm Olivia Quay. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow on The Big Story.